Ja, nochmal ganz herzlich willkommen.
So, once again, a very warm welcome. I don't want to speak of a final event in any sense. It would be good to have the right index card when I've written things down. But I can say afternoon focus, because that's to which I now welcome you. I would like to start by saying something that Adam Greenfield wrote in his book, and he quotes an older Siemens brochure, 10, 15 years old, and your interpreter can only paraphrase. In a few decades, cities will have numerous autonomous IT systems that know user habits extremely well. The idea is to use resources and control uses to the optimum with this method. Now, that may sound like a promise. It may also sound like a horror vision. What it's about is the so-called smart city, or very roughly, it's about how local and municipal authorities imagine technical progress can be harnessed to become more efficient, despite all the reservations about efficiency, which we all remember from last night. We know that, among others, Alphabet, the Google parent, is really driving that subject with a vision very similar to what we've just had described. And in Europe, one can say the viewpoint is slightly different. 2 years ago, the German government initiated a dialogue platform entitled Smart Cities. After that, we had a Smart City Charter last year, which deals primarily with participation, a digital coming of age. So it all sounds rather different from what we've heard. Now, we will start the keynote with Francesca Bria, who's come to join us from Barcelona. That is the one city which in 2015 still had the title of smartest city of the world. But since then, they've switch things around rather differently. For practical purposes, Francesca is in charge of digital and the digital and technical fate of her city. A very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to be here. I know that it's not easy. You had a very long event and very intense event, so it is absolutely a pleasure for me to be here today. In particular, because I think it is pretty urgent and pretty important to have an event about digital capitalism that is not only a public debate, that is not only a theoretical event about digital capitalism, but where we have all the relevant stakeholders, political parties, unions, movements, citizens, and cities that needs to really strengthen alliances to have a shared understanding of what is happening, but also to put forward practical alternatives. And I'm going to talk about here about our alternative that we are developing in Barcelona, and in particular about how it is possible to build a smart city that is based on data sovereignty, and what kind of social contract we can imagine for the digital society. In my perspective, a bottom-up social contract that comes really from cities. Let me start by saying that I think that cities today have a crucial role in becoming possibly a laboratory for futures that is more democratic and sustainable. And why? Also because, as we are seeing today, nation-states have a lot of difficulties to respond to some of the global challenges that are economic, that are social, and political that we're facing. Some of those, inequalities, climate change, migration, geopolitical and financial instability, job stagnation, and wage depression. And it's because of the collapse of the system that many talk about the crisis of legitimacy of the liberal world order. And this is what is giving a rise to nationalisms and populisms a bit all around the world, and nationalists going to power in many places in the world. And I think that cities, because they are closer to the citizens, because they are closer to our territory, the proximity of our neighborhood and communities, can actually together be an alternative to this situation. If you look at the techno-economic change, and robot economy and platform capitalism, so everything that you've been discussing here today. Of course, we know that some trends like the combination of artificial intelligence, mass computation, robotization, and automation, it is going to change our government, our society, and our economy in a very strong way, as we are discussing today. But my question, with disruptive application in autonomous driving, healthcare, machine learning in healthcare system, precision agriculture, artificial intelligence used in cybersecurity, I mean, many applications that we've been discussing. But my question is, are all those trends, and also the social and economic crisis that I was mentioning before, are going to be accelerated by the rise of big tech? And in what sense big tech poses new challenges that I don't think are technical challenges, but fundamental challenges about monopoly power, about the need of a new digital tax, about trade regulation, about mass unemployment, and questions around civil liberties and the declining faith in liberal democracy and our privacy. So, of course, we can say we see a new market power, which is probably unprecedented, unparalleled. And one of the main political questions of our time is, how do we tame the big tech? So if we look at here, these are the big corporations that are the largest, the big tech companies are the largest firms by market capitalization, with a combined market value of around $3 trillion US. And $1 trillion US is offshored directly by these companies. So 80% of corporate wealth lives in 10% of these firms, and this is usually going into share buybacks and payment dividends. It doesn't really trickle down to the ordinary people. It doesn't make us all better off. And these are, if you look at the name of these firms, Alphabet, Amazon, Alibaba, Microsoft, Facebook, Tencent, it's American and Chinese corporation. There is not even one European company. And what is these companies? What are they monetizing? On what is based the digital economy? Well, lots of what these companies are monetizing, that in the first place receive mass government funding to create this brilliant innovation that we enjoy today, is us. They are extracting our data, the data that we produce in our social life. And so we talk, actually Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, he talks about a data industrial complex. So data is really the raw material of the digital economy, and it fuels artificial intelligence. And here I have a quote from Angela Merkel in Davos, where she says, "Who owns data will decide in the end whether a democracy, a participatory social model, and economic prosperity can be combined." So this is really about choosing in what kind of world we want to live in the future. So many economists, looking at the metaphor, using the metaphor of data as oil, talk about data extractivism. So this data that we continuously produce and is extracted, and today is in the hands of very few companies. So an extractive rent-based economic model. There is the professor in Harvard Business School, Shoshana Zuboff, that you may know. She's out with a new book, Surveillance Capitalism, and she talks about the economic surveillance of this business model. So the behavioral surplus that is continuously extracted by all the users and is very central to the value creation process of those giant firms. Another question that is really concerning globally is the question of, are we living in a black box society? So before my speech, there was a panel on the question of ethics and algorithms. If it is true that AI, and in particular deep learning, machine learning, is the most fundamental technology of our time, imagine that these big companies like Amazon and Google invest over 15 billion yearly in R&D. And now we have new wealth funds, specific vehicles like SoftBank Vision Fund, the Chinese government that are investing billions. The Chinese government talk about 300 billion investment in the next couple of years in artificial intelligence. This is, of course, a challenge for states. But also, what are the social, ethical implication of artificial intelligence? Many experts agree that we want to end black box algorithms in government, that we need accountability, that we need to make those transparent. Maybe we should open up the algorithms. because of all this concentration of power and the kind of general situation, what is the role of cities? What can cities do in this context? Well, I argue that cities can create public value. And as I was saying before, cities can recognize that the immense value that is created by data and algorithms and AI and mass computation should be given back to the citizens. And because there is a lot of economic potential and social potential in this data, if citizens can control this data, and this data can be unleashed for the creation of new public services, new social infrastructure, we can create public value, and not only private profits for a few. And I've written a study together with Evgeny Morozov that is entitled Rethinking the Smart City and Urbanizing, Democratizing Urban Technology when we argue these kind of things. Today, if we look at smart city landscape around the world, as it was mentioned in the introduction, we see, for example, private cities built from scratch by technology giants, like Bill Gates is building his own private city in Arizona, and Google, of course, is building a kind of privatized smart city in Toronto, where the entire infrastructure for transportation and data and the cloud system and the software will be owned by one company, Google. And of course, they say to the public officials, well, we'll talk about later about the business model and who owns what. So we do have an alternative to this model. So this is our mayor, she's Ada Colau. She was elected to become the mayor of Barcelona from a very grassroots platform. She was the leader of the right to the housing, the right to the city movement, and she was elected into power with a very radical social agenda. Actually, she's advocating for a democratic revolution. And then she called me. I used to be in London working for the UK government. I'm actually Italian, I'm not Catalan. And yes, and she asked me to go to Barcelona with a very clear mission. And the mission was, can we imagine, can we design technology and data that serve the citizens, that serve the people? And this is a fantastic challenge. So why don't we make sure that the democratic revolution that she's advocating for can actually be implemented? And of course, how do you implement it in the 21st century? Also with technology and the new digital infrastructures. So we started from a collective intelligence from democracy process. So instead of building the smart city as it is usually built, starting from technology first, so you first talk about connectivity, big data, sensor network, and then only after you talk about why do we need a smart city at all? What kind of problems we are trying to solve? We started by asking citizens and involving citizens into the policy-making process. Over 400,000 citizens of Barcelona were directly involved in creating the government agenda, which is usually a pretty boring, bureaucratic process that happens in closed door. We opened it up to the citizens with a hybrid process of online democracy and offline democracy in the different neighborhoods, making sure that we have different social demographic, participate in different social classes, and so on, different ethnic background. And today, 72% of the action plan that we run in government were proposed directly from citizens. It is very important when we think about rethinking the smart city to ensure that it serves citizens, that we couple the technology agenda with the real political and social challenges that we're facing. We need to align technology with the kind of objectives that we want to solve. For Barcelona, our agenda was clear. We want right to affordable housing. We want healthcare for all, sustainable mobility. We are pushing forward energy transition. Barcelona has created a new municipal company for solar energy to provide energy for all the municipal buildings, and now we have a pilot for 3,000 public housing. And fight to climate change, which is absolutely central because it improves the quality of life. So here you can see one of the projects. It's called Barcelona Superblock. So what is the city of Barcelona doing is closing to traffic 16 districts of the city. to improve, to basically stop the cars to enter to these districts, but also to grow more green spaces together with urbanists, with architects, with residents themselves. They're redefining the use of public space. And we got back the city to the people. 60% of the public space that used to be occupied by car. And of course, this is part of a bigger laboratory on the future of mobility, where we are increasing bicycle lanes, and we are rethinking future of mobility that is going to be integrated and also involve things like autonomous cars. Another very important issue for us, which is very connected to the kind of infrastructure, like water, like roads, like the air we breathe, like public infrastructure, is data. Will data be controlled by big business, by the state, or by citizens in the future? So we think that actually the data should be controlled by citizens themselves, that cities can be able to make data a public infrastructure, as I said, like water, like energy, like roads, like the air we breathe, a common good, but which is controlled by the citizen, not by the state. And the citizens are the ones that have to decide what data they want to keep private and have the right to encryption and to keep the data private, what data they want to share, with whom, and on what terms. And the terms should be set by citizens and not by the corporations. So that's why we put forward a new ethical and responsible data strategy, what we call a new social pact on data. And we have this mandating transparency, privacy, and security by design, respecting information self-determination as a fundamental right of citizens, and then, of course, making sure that we also create open standards, interoperability, and open API for the infrastructure of the city. And make sure that automated decision systems are controlled in a way that we can ensure accountability. It is our objective to make algorithm public, but also to use this in the negotiation with big companies like the platform economy, like Uber or Airbnb. If algorithms are made public, it is more easy for public officials to regulate and govern what otherwise is impossible, because we don't know what's inside the black box. So in this vision, we believe cities can become custodians of the new digital rights of citizens. We're also doing lots of initiatives to open up governance through transparency. It is very important because we run from a bottom-up kind of movement, and we're trying to make government more transparent, more collaborative, and more open. And so we are creating an ethical digital standard for cities, where we are trying to make government services more agile. We are bringing contracts, public contracts online, so that all the companies can see what kind of money are spent, how we spend public money, where we allocate the contracts, make it easier for SMEs and startups and smaller companies to work with the city, get the bids of the government, so that the talent of the city, like the startups, the innovators, can also build services with the city of Barcelona. And I tell you what we're doing with procurement. So I know that procurement is this unsexy world that, you know, everybody's like, yeah, procurement. Actually, procurement is the very core of what government do. We spend citizen money to buy services and infrastructure. So we decided to include clauses in the public contract to make procurement ethical, sustainable, and innovative. So we reform procurement. I mean, not only we introduce like basic salary minimum wage, we introduce environmental clauses, gender standards, but also technological sovereignty standards, in particular data sovereignty. Every contract in the city of Barcelona, we say that the data belongs to the citizens of Barcelona. So the company that win the contracts have to give us back the data in machine-readable format, and it becomes a public good. It is in the public domain. And this allows us to build our capabilities. We're also actually investing in open source software and interoperability. Barcelona has invested 80% of the IT budget in open source solution and free software. And then, of course, because this is mostly about organizational and cultural change, it is not a technological change, we are working with our workers to empower them, with our public officials, with a change management and capability plan, because we need to build capacity inside the public sector. A lot of it has been outsourced, and the knowledge, critical knowledge, has been outsourced from the public sector. How do we get that back in? So use digitalization as an excuse to build new capabilities in the public sector and work with the workers. So we're also doing things like open data, open budget. We have an infrastructure that is against corruption. So we're using an encrypted infrastructure like the one that uses WikiLeaks. It's based on Tor. And this allows any citizens and public officials to denounce cases of corruption in the city of Barcelona. And then we have an expert group on anti-corruption that acts on this kind of signaling. The city of Barcelona also manages the infrastructure of the city. We have 600 kilometers of fiber that the city owns. On top of that, we open Internet of Things sensor network. It's called Centillo, because it's open standards. Many cities in the world were able to reuse it. And on top of the sensor network, we built a data lake, a data analytics platform that allow us to do machine learning and data analytics on the data. Of course, privacy and security by design, so really maintaining anonymity and data privacy for people. And then we built a new office, which is a mayor's office for data analytics. 40 new people we hired that are able to do machine learning, data scientists, and help us to open up the black boxes, data and algorithmic transparency, and use data to take better decisions. But I think we're going a bit beyond that. We are not only creating this data infrastructure as a public good, but we're also working on data sovereignty for citizens. So this is a project, it's called Decode. Barcelona is leading it. It's co-financed by the European Commission. And what we're trying to do is we're using the so-called distributed ledger or blockchain with an extra layer of encryption to make sure that people can have full control over their data. And as I said at the beginning, citizens can decide what data they want to keep private, what data they want to share with whom, and set the terms and conditions. And we're doing 2 pilots now. One is for our digital democracy platform, so that we don't get in the Cambridge Analytica Facebook world where data is manipulated for election purposes and our behavioral data is tracked and used for manipulation. But basically, we allow for transparency, accountability of the data, and control of the data from the people. And then we're also doing an Internet of Things pilot where we're putting sensors, Arduino boxes in the homes of citizens so that they're able to monitor air quality, noise pollution, and to share the data in an encrypted way so that they can decide what data they share with what community. This is what we call social and communal rights to data. This is a collective rights that we need to fight for. So this is our vision. Basically, data as a public infrastructure. Cities can build city data commons, and what that means is we can create a layer which is a data commons layer of the data that we use in the city, personal data controlled by the citizens, and then with rules, which are the GDPR rules, so privacy and security by design, ethics, data portability, the right to be forgotten, all these European values and principles, we regulate the access to the data, and then we make sure that we open up the data for cooperatives, for SMEs, for citizens themselves that can use this data to create future data-driven and artificial intelligence-driven services in healthcare, in transportation, in education to build a better society. So we're also really trying to empower companies to help us to do that. And that's why we're working on mission innovation in the city, creating an urban innovation lab where the city set the challenge. It can be improving education, affordable housing, or mobility. And then companies can help us resolve these challenges so that we can work together with the local industry. This is a debate that touches a lot the question of the sharing economy. As you know, cities have been in the avant-garde of trying to regulate these companies. Why? Because basically, if you have a business model like Uber or Airbnb, it has a very clear impact in the taxi kind of transportation system, but also in the workers' type of contracts, as you well know, in the environmental standards, in the price of housing. So Airbnb, as it is a problem common to Berlin, it has contributed to increase the prices of housing, short-term rental, of 3 times Barcelona for the last few years. So how can city regulate these companies? Well, now we're coming together. Actually, we have a summit, the Sharing City Summit, this month, where Berlin, Barcelona, Amsterdam, New York are coming together to find common standards to regulate those companies, making sure that they pay taxes, making sure that they obey to local regulation, and make sure that they start sharing the data that they gather from all the citizens and the public data of the city, because this should be basically a public good, but also this can be used to regulate those companies more efficiently. But we're also going beyond that. So not only regulation, but how can we create alternatives? And that's why we are pushing for alternatives, cooperative model of owning data. Imagine like an Uber system that can be owned by the drivers themselves, that can be self-organized. If you have the data and the platform and the technology, this can be done. And then you can put the kind of regulation that you want so that you maximize the public return. We're also doing a project, Make in Barcelona, where we are building on the capabilities of the Industry 4.0, I mean, the whole kind of automation of manufacturing, but democratizing at the city level. So imagining a future urban manufacturing, leveraging the power of the makers movement, and build more circular economy models. There is an entire district in Barcelona, it's called the Maker District, where we are experimenting these kind of alternative models. And finally, the future of work. Of course, we know how it will be important, education, skills, capacity, reinventing the future of work, but not only when people lose their jobs, from the very early ages. So that's why we are building a program which is about learning by doing, which is learning by programming, STEM education, which is science, technology, mathematics, but also arts in the schools, and learning digital manufacturing. So we created 4 public fab labs which are introducing this program in the curriculum of all Catalan schools. And then we are empowering women in tech, because finally, I am a woman, and my mayor is a feminist, so we're advocating for a feminist city. I mean, the digital revolution has to be also a feminist revolution, and we have 2 little women in tech, so we need to empower women to basically shape the future society we're gonna live on together. And a global alliance of cities, yeah. A global alliance of cities can make a difference. Barcelona is very actively involved in building the Fearless Cities movement. We convened a big summit last year with 140 countries, 5 continents, 180 cities. I mean, a lot of cities are working together to build a fearless city movement that is also going to face this kind of rising nationalism and fascisms around the world. Let me just end my presentation by saying that I am very optimistic and energetic about what cities can do and what citizens can achieve from the bottom up together with the movement. But I also know that these are issues where we require alliances with progressive parties, with states, at the European level, because obviously, if we see the battle for digital supremacy and we see the size and the magnitude of the monopolies of tech companies from the US and China, these are things that we need to find an alternative model for that, which require really a higher level of debate. And we need to democratize data ownership and artificial intelligence, provide an alternative model. So I know this is very dense, but I just put it there because also I'm doing a lot of work on the broader political framework and regulatory framework of what can be done to reclaim Europe digital sovereignty, which I hope that Germany will lead the way towards doing that. And of course, we need antitrust and competition, new rules against market dominance of the tech giants. We need taxation of digital monopoly platforms. Large tech firms, as I said before, have offshored around 1 trillion in the last decade. So we need to close the tax loopholes and find innovative taxation models, like the one is debated in Europe right now, taxing revenues and not profits, but also recognizing that the value around the data is co-produced by all of us, by the citizens. So yes, also doing something about that data. Digital trade is a new regulatory battleground. You see it very well in Germany, in particular the car manufacturers. So it's going to have a big impact, the new tariff on tech goods. Cross-border data flow versus data localization will be a fundamental issue for the future. And we need to ensure privacy, cybersecurity, and condition for competition. We also need national strategy and large state support to develop artificial intelligence in Europe, chips, quantum computing, and algorithms. But this is not going to be 20 billions if the Chinese are investing 300 billions. It needs to be much broader support because these are the key industries of the future. And we need those capabilities to provide future public services linked to the Industry 4.0 strategy that you have developed here in Germany, but also with strong worker protection to avoid social dumping and precarization of labor that we see in the gig economy. We also need to take back control of data and recognize data as a public good, as a public infrastructure. And the terms of data control needs to be defined by citizens themselves. This is a question that impacts industrial strategy, but also national security. And the question of protecting cyber-critical national infrastructure is key. If you see who owns the software, the hardware, the chips, the 5G network in Europe, and the data which is consumed on top of it, it's mainly foreign multinationals. So we need to tackle dependence on external technology. And maybe we can do something by changing the contracting rules, as we have done in Barcelona, but at the state level and European level. And finally, we need to recognize the digital economy to benefit citizens, not only for big military purpose or commercial. Now we need to invest on the digital economy that will benefit the many, not just the few. And based on better workers, environmental, citizen rights to bring long-term social innovation. This is really the last slide. I'm an optimist that Europe can develop a people-centric digital future with decentralized emancipatory alternatives. So we need to challenge the current narrative dominated by Silicon Valley's leaky surveillance capitalism on one side and the dystopian model with unlimited data collection, such as the China's social credit system. A new deal on data and artificial intelligence based on rights-based, people-centric framework that does not exploit personal data to pay for critical infrastructure is long overdue, and I do think it's a matter of democracy. So Barcelona is happy to show the way, but we need to work together to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please go over to the panel. This is your... Thank you very much. Please take a seat. Und wir machen die Runde hier oben noch mal größer.
And we're going to invite some more people here to join the panel. So Lothar Schröder, he is with us. He is a member of the executive committee at Verdi, the trade union for services, and he's responsible for innovations and decent work. And he is also the member of the lead commission on ethical work. And Saskia Esken, she is a member of the German Bundestag, and in the parliamentary group, she is the spokesperson for digital affairs. So thank you for coming and welcome. Joachim Schonowski is with us too. And now I need to read what his function is. And he is the head of Smart Cities Innovation with Deutsche Telekom. And he has a double qualification. And it is very interesting here in this round. And he's also the chairman of the Smart Cities with the German Standards Institution, DIN. Francesca Bria. So you've seen all the passionate responses, and it all sounds too good to be true. So where is the catch?
Also, abgesehen von...
Well, you mentioned the crisis with the nation state, but you have no other problems in Barcelona? Not at all?
Well, obviously, I think not. I mean, everything I told you about is a plan that has been implemented at the moment in the city of Barcelona. So these are not just ideas. I mean, this is our political plan. We are doing that things like everything you saw. Obviously, nothing is easy. I mean, obviously, not only in the question of digital capitalism. I mean, if you look things like affordable housing, I mean, this is something that is very hard to tackle for a lot of the cities in Europe and beyond. energy sovereignty and the energy transition, fight climate change, create more livable cities and more public space. I mean, these are all basically fights that require a mobilization of citizens and communities. So I think that obviously what is interesting about, I think, the Barcelona in Común, or what is happening in Barcelona at the moment, is that we do see a crisis of trust, you know, between the citizens and the public institutions. And we take it really seriously, this question of devolving more power to the community and more power to the people. And actually what I'm observing in Barcelona is that a lot of the time, it's not true that people are not prepared to take on, you know, to have more power and to have more democracy, to take better decisions about what they need for their neighborhood and how they want to, you know, spend the resources. It's public institutions are actually not prepared to do that. So we are working a lot to change the government and the public sector and to make the public sector more porous, more collaborative, more open to citizens' problems and citizen instances, so that they can feel they have a much better, they can influence decision making, they can really participate then in the management of the services and of this kind of policies we're trying to implement. So I think that at the end, the real question is, how do you do it together with the population, and how you make sure that you have an agenda that is not just, you know, our mayor's agenda or the government agenda, but that is really this participatory democracy process that we're trying to implement is at the very core of what it will make it successful or not.
Vielen Dank. Saskia, Esken, die Frage steht ja im...
Thank you very much. Saskia, there is the question, and I'm sure that you have been watching the developments in Barcelona for a while. So when you see that, why are we in Germany not there where they are in Barcelona?
Vielen Dank für Ihre Frage. Lassen Sie mich hier.
I would say thanks very much for your question, but first of all, perhaps, I mean, I would like to answer something else, because that's not the most important question, I think. Well, I mean, okay, yes, if you want, I say something about the question I was asked, but let's first of all say something else. The development, is that going to be taken out of our hands or not? That's what it's all about, really. Is it up to us? Yeah, we try to tackle it, certainly. But the question also implies, what about broadband, and why haven't we digitized our administration yet? And all these things that, you know, regularly people complain to the government about. I'm a member of the Digital Agenda Committee of the German Parliament, and I've always said that the government's digital agenda is fine, but what we need is lots of digital agendas in the local communities. And we don't want people to think about, we've got this new technology, what can we use it for? Must make sense for us, so let's think about something. No, it has to be the other way around. We've got problems for us as a local authority. How can we achieve greater participation? How can we think about the life that our citizens will lead the next 20, 30 years? How shall we imagine the future of our local authority? How do we organize public services being rendered to people, especially in the countryside? And then we ask, how can technology help? That's a good approach, and I think that's what I see people do in Barcelona. With all the enthusiasm for technology which may be behind it, and which is right and good, and which I even share as somebody who's a computer scientist originally. So it is all good. But why haven't we got that far in Germany? I think this grassroots development is not something which has started in German local areas yet. Many communities haven't really understood this idea of participation. I mean, they see it as part of civil society, but not as a local authority job, not as something which is a political job. Very regrettable, actually. But I think particularly when we have such wonderful examples as the presentation we just heard, we will get further as well. So thanks very much for this inspiring presentation. It wowed me. Thank you. We keep hearing that local authorities, municipalities are overtaxed, that they lack the technical know-how, and that's one of the reasons why in the town halls people tend to say, well, we want to cooperate with the big names, with the big companies. If there is somebody coming to the local politicians to make some attractive proposal, they go for it. Mr. Schonowski, what's your assessment. In Barcelona, it doesn't seem to be the problem. What's the difference? Why is Germany different? I would like to try and give you a variety of different answers. First of all, for the people here in the room, smart, sustainable cities is one thing, but the other side is I'm also working not just in the team of the smart, sustainable cities, but also Digital Summit. We're writing all sorts of papers, how to approach these things. I was involved in that. I'm also in part of the German industry standard for the Smart City Standards Forum, where standards is a big issue, open standards. And by the way, we've written 2 standards right at the beginning, which I, with my team, are currently implementing as a test project. And the third thing I'm doing is I also work at the European Union, where I've got a beacon project with the city of Hamburg called My Smart Life Theory, Practice in the Lab, and Implementation. That's all what I'm doing. So now what you're asking me. Because you see, the thing is really about that in Germany, we've actually got quite far with our infrastructure. It's not true that we're starting from scratch. When you compare that with some other European cities or even other European countries, and sporadically, the German infrastructure is quite good. But the next step we have to do, digitization, street lamps. I can exchange LED lights and can put in sensors and all of that, but it doesn't make sense to do it everywhere. So let's use common sense as well. And the second thing, one of the big issues people always quote are Chinese cities. Well, these cities have millions of inhabitants, and they sometimes build them as new towns in a greenfield. But here we have lots of cities that have already been in existence for yonks, and we've got lots of small cities. And the average European city size is 100 to 500,000, the majority of cities. And now we have a problem. Francesca, of course, is happy in the sense 500,000, that's something you can start. It's the same for me in Munich, and I know the colleague in Munich, they have a lot to do. But how much has a city like Cuxhaven got? Smaller places. And that brings me to the third point. You see, the question is always that we need to make sure we find local partners to work with. And that's actually something we really stand for. It's a big issue. I've written that in the book as well. The countryside. We mustn't forget the countryside. I find that an amazing controversy. On the one hand, we've got higher rents in the cities, and on the other hand, living in the countryside is incredibly cheap. So how can we make sure we drag the countryside into the digital age? But in the rural areas, we have a problem. Let's stay with the city of Cuxhaven, 50,000 inhabitants in that city. How can they have a digital strategy? And that's where I see companies like ours are obliged to do something. We're happy to help them. We need to support them in developing a proper concept. We need to help them implement it. But I also want to emphasize this data sovereignty is something we are looking at in the Standards Committee. We see ourselves as an enabler, also as a company. Enabling is our DNA. We want to enable others, support them. And I think working together, we need to get to somewhere which is very important to me. Bitkom in Germany has this approach of setting up a national competence center for smart cities. I think that's probably going to be quite important because I agree with Francesca. We need to find an answer in Europe how we can develop things, how a digital agenda, let's say, can come out of Germany, but can be developed in Europe, with Europe, as a counterpoint to what is happening elsewhere. I think there's a lot that we can do. And I think I've given you a variety of different answers. Well, but you've also given rise to lots more questions. Mr. Schröder, all these issues are issues that you address from the union point of view, but perhaps I can pick up on something what you said about this gap that exists between urban and rural areas, because that's very much an issue, also from a union point. How do you see that? Are we driving this gap between urban and rural citizens even deeper? People always talk about cities getting smarter. I don't agree with that. I think actually we're starting with beacon projects. We're showing people how things can be done. What we need to do is resolve the issue, how we can make this decision-making power work and roll it out. But the question you asked at the beginning is, why haven't we got very far in Germany yet? I think in Germany we're rather peculiar when it's a questions about we the citizens advise the government. We've been very critical about the census at the time, and we were all surprised that once the internet gained ground, we as customers ran ahead of me, the critical unionist, because we buy all the stuff and nobody asks who does what with my data, and that whole industry exists on the basis of citizens' data. So I think we need to develop a healthy understanding of what are the data that a society need to be smart, controlled and supported. I'll give you an example of what I mean. We had a dispute in Nuremberg where a big German telecommunications company actually measure the SIM card density at tube stations. And the city council said, well, come on, this is a dreadful violation of personal right and privacy, but they neglected the fact that, of course, they can do this in a perfectly anonymized way. And a smart selection of data, the data aren't safe, but smart, but you can be smart in connecting them or make smart answers come out of them. And we could find out that between 7 and in the afternoon, you've got far more SIM cards because it means that people will use the tube much more. And we haven't got a healthy understanding of how to use data and when to use data. Why is it so interesting what the keynote speaker said? It's interesting for us because that is an encouraging vision. We in Germany, well, we always spent 3 years talking about opportunities and risks. More about the risks than about the opportunities, actually. And sometimes somebody says, what do we want to achieve with that? But that's a question we should ask right at the beginning. We should together think up a vision as to what to do with the available data. How can we create a world that we want to live in both citizens and in the countryside that is worth living in for us? There are lots of examples of that, starting with transport control. I've given you another example here. Also, energy supply can be made much smarter, medical care. And that way you can reach out to even those people who may not live in the immediate proximity of specialist doctors. But what we need is a vision. We need to say what we want to do and what we don't want to do. You talked about me as a unionist. If I say we want to do this in a spirit of participation, then we have to make sure we also take the people with us whose jobs are affected. If you now find that digitization means job shedding, let's say 350,000 jobs will be lost. That's one of the studies which Ms. Nahles of the SPD has commissioned. But if we then don't say, what do we do about it? That isn't good. I mean, we have to give an answer and say things like, we will be able to have more time for the citizens. Maybe we will cut waiting hours in official offices because the waiting hours there are amazing. That would be an answer. But we don't have this holistic approach to the problem. We always see individual problems. We're very risk-focused in our thinking, and what we urgently need is a vision how at local and municipal level we deal with it. I would like to ask a question about that. We know certainly that Germans are extremely sensitive when it comes to transferring their data to the state or leaving it to the government to decide. But we also know that every single Facebook user, every German who uses Google gives his or her data to these big companies. I mean, throws them in front of them, as it were. Well, it's a contradiction that we live in as people. I mean, as consumers, we accept this. I mean, my generation, sooner or later, we had this the census problem where we had informational self-determination as a result of our opposition to the census. And now we are surprised that the young generation with this total exhibitionism about their data. So these worlds don't fit anymore. We need to understand what we want to do with data, where the data go and how they're used. We've reached that point a few times. It's definitely something for education as well. Well, we need to get into the nitty-gritty here, and I know that's very difficult when we're talking about smart cities, which I would like to focus on a bit more as well. Ms. Esken, please give us examples as concrete as possible. When is a city or local authority smart? As Ms. Bria said, there seems to be a sort of struggle of the systems. In Toronto, we see model projects where surveillance goes all the way into the bedroom in order to optimize procedures, to make sure that your fridge is replenished in time and what have you, to optimize energy consumption. For Germany, this is unimaginable, certainly, but what is it that we want? I think Lothar Schröder has already talked about this, and so did Francesca Bria. We really, right now, are at a crossroads. We want neither the US-American models with big-scale surveillance, nor do we want the Chinese model. What we want to do and I'm convinced that we actually are able, we want to make sure that our data protection and privacy requirements can be combined with the best possible data use, creating not just added value for companies, but added value for society. We want to reconcile these two things. We can do it. I think data protection is an interesting subject too, but no, I mean, it's very important for me. No, but let's talk about concrete applications, if you like. Where do municipalities have to change something immediately? Are we talking about street lighting? Are we talking about digitized citizens' offices? In other words, we have to get into concrete matters. Well, certainly traffic flows need to be improved, and also the nodes between different modes of transport, that needs to be much better controlled as it is today. That would be one of those applications, which, however, I do not want to leave in the hands of companies. I want to see that run by governments, and even governments can do this in the way that complies with data protection. Unlike companies, I mean, transport is definitely a government area, but I am very much aware of the problems, and I see an even greater potential when we're talking about smart country. I mean, why these local authorities aren't supposed to be called town or city, who cares? But let's call them smart country. That's very important because we have big problems when it comes to rendering public services in the rural areas. How can we solve those? But we can do that by using good technology and technologies that use data and knowledge. And better healthcare is definitely part of that for the whole of the countryside, and it also entails more supply close to the people. In other words, going into the villages or allowing people to stay in their villages, not just because rents are low, but because people actually enjoy living there. But, they can't stay living there if they don't have two cars or if they are too old to drive a car. And then they all want to stay at home. Everybody wants to stay at home when getting old. But if you don't have any supplies, how can you do that? Our adult education centers can't even find people to teach anymore because those who would like to do it are so involved in their professional lives and they're involved in commuting, so they can't spend, every Wednesday 6 o'clock attending an evening course. But online courses are good and they're needed because, as we've said, education is key to participate even in the digital world. Now, I've heard some concrete things. Thank you very much for that. There is one other point, something which we always arrive at when we hear about these sort of outlines which people like to give us. People always say, let's keep cars out of inner cities. Do people want that in Germany? I will take that question, but I'll rewrap it, if you like, because there are a few things that are important to me. First of all, smart city is a term I don't use myself. I'm just talking about a digital transformation of local authorities or municipalities that gets me away from this urban-rural thing. And the second thing, which I find very important, I agree. In the US, you have a very, very liberal approach. In China, you have a very politically controlled approach. In Europe, we're in the middle. But the problem is, and that brings me back to my standards, standardization is a field I really know, and everybody knows me there. There are 5 people, just 5, in the TC268 at the ISO and JTC1. These are 2 bodies and our people, 18 to 20 altogether in our Smart Cities Forum. That's all of us. That includes municipalities and a few companies. But what Francesca has talked about, can we manage that with these few people? So my question is also, how can we manage to get more people with know-how involved in designing whatever future we want? So that's point 1. Point 2, I'm quite cautious here, but as another point that matters to me, we need to think about the fact that perhaps for the first, well, not for the very first time, but for one of the first times, we find ourselves faced with a situation where we see much more cooperation, which is necessary on the part of politics, the administration, industry, and the citizens. Much more cooperation than the past. In the past, many things worked on their own. And smart city is the point. Instead of this sort of island thinking, you have to combine things and develop an understanding of that. And this understanding is the next step we need to take. Next thing, if I'm just looking at which cities have got how far, it doesn't matter. We need to look at the approach. Because when I'm saying city, then that's a huge, complex area. I can talk an hour or hours about cities. Well, may I remind you, I wanted to talk about concrete things. Yeah, don't worry, I'm getting there. What's a city like Copenhagen do when it comes to vehicle transport? They say, right, I want to be CO2 neutral, which is why they've decided to go for the bicycle. So, but they've taken one subject, not lots of them. But they've put their focus on just one issue. And if you now go to Copenhagen, you will see pedestrians first, second cyclist, and then, as an also-ran, the car. And then you have an answer. That's the answer I want to give you. How can I do things? Every single city is different, and every city has to find its own goal. For Oldenburg, they have a pedestrian-only zone. What you said is sensible. Ban the cars from there. For other cities, it may not make sense. So we're looking at the main KPI and the main goal. That's the most important thing, not just less traffic. Think about this. There are also rebound effects, because suddenly you may find yourself facing a situation where you may have a more efficient transport sector, and cities have said that actually attracts more people to drive with their own cars and thereby emitting even more CO2. So you've got to make things right. That's the big job. That's why I talked about the nodes, so we can bridge the different modes of transport. It's not just the car transport we need to control. We need to control people's movements better. Movements in transport, whether you're a pedestrian, whether you're a cyclist, whether you're using public transport, or whether you're using individual transport on the sides on the lines of bicycle or car. We must make sure there's a flowing transport. The way I understand it, the Social Democrats at the moment want to make sure that these cars can drive in inner cities without special badges. I'm happy to talk about diesels with you, but I don't really think that's the subject now, and I really don't think it's very sensible. I've got an electric vehicle, by the way. Here in Berlin, I don't use a car at all. Why should I? Anyway, there is one other thing I would like to add, why I think the term smart city is better than smart country, because it has the root of citizen in it. And something which enthuses me so much about the Barcelona approach is participation. And the question, how do the citizens want to live in their cities? They have to have a voice in this. We heard about sovereignty, we heard about emancipation. And that's not something that starts simply by having data sovereignty, especially when it comes to our personal data. It starts with having a say in what we want to develop. It's up to the citizens to decide their own future. And that's why in this agenda we're talking about smart cities. I insist on that term, even if the government, they now talk about implementation strategies. I think agenda is good, and the smart city agenda is good too, because in the various other years under Leipziger, Müller and so on, we had some agenda processes which were an excellent example for participation in our municipalities. And we can reissue that in digital form today.
Danke dafür.
Thank you very much, Francesca Bria. I was thinking of one question when I was listening to your presentation. So this participation approach, it is highly interesting for young people, for digital natives anyway, who from day to night carry their devices with them all around. But what about the older generation who are saying, well, I'm not really interested in all this computer stuff? How do you take those people on board?
Can I make a couple of comments first?
Ich glaube, das ist der Charakter dieser Runde.
I think this is just the nature of this discussion, so I'll remind you of the question later.
First of all, I wanted to say that really this question of the digital city of the future and the digital sovereignty, I mean, it should be posed not only as a technical question, really, but as a political question. I think this is very important, because it's almost like, you know, when I talk about these things, I don't try to explain to the citizens the kind of technical issues about, you know, data and interoperability and this and that and the standards. I mean, of course, we all know that this is important, but I ask, do you want your healthcare to be managed by Google? Do you want your transportation and your education to be managed by SoftBank and Uber? That's how you see the future of your life. Do you want to continue to live in debt in the gig economy where you are precarious and you have less and less rights? I think these are the questions. I mean, this is the model that we are discussing. What is the future looking like? And I think this is, I think this should be, and I think that's why, you know, our politicians most of the time avoid to talk about these things, because technology is not just for the, it's not a technocratic thing, it's not just for the technologists, it is really now impacting the political and economic model that we're choosing. So I think that more and more, please, our politicians, this discussion have to be at the very core of what, when we discuss, you know, housing, migration, and so on, we should also, and climate change, we should also discuss these kind of things at the same level of importance. Let me just clarify our vision for data, and then I'll get to participation. When we say that data is a public infrastructure and it should be governed as a common good, I don't see it in a kind of centralized big brother approach where the state decide what data you want to share and decide everything about your data. This is not going to be a feasible approach. I mean, we are building infrastructure that are decentralized, privacy enhancing, and put the rights of the people at the center. And also that give the ability to citizens themselves to really take that kind of decision about what is the data that I want to keep private. And sorry, encryption should be a human right. Like, people should have the right to keep their data private. And we have the amazing expertise in Europe. That's why, you know, all these crypto technologies being built now in Switzerland. We have the best privacy and security researchers in the world. This is a competitive advantage of Europe. And then, you know, you build this infrastructure, digital identity, reputation, and payment should be owned by the public, because otherwise it will be in the hands of the big corporation. And then, you know, on top of that, you can create more competition at the service level, yeah? And maybe differential access. So if Facebook want to access for our data, they should pay for it, not us. But then if local cooperatives, local industries, and citizens want to use that data to build services for the public good, then they should have access for free, you know, as a kind of free and open access. And I think this is the kind of vision that is practical. It can be implemented, and I hope really this is the new deal on data, that Europe should do something about it.
Francesca, thank you very much. I think everybody likes
No, I just want to clarify this, because otherwise it's like the state is gonna...
I reminded everybody else here of my question after about 2 minutes
yeah.
to...
And the question about
what about the elderly people?
So democratic participation, actually I was very surprised about the data that we see. It is, we have over 65, many people are participating. It's not for the digital natives, but this is also because we're taking a hybrid and mixed approach. It is not just digital democracy. It is not just Facebook democracy like click here. We are combining an online approach with offline approach. I mean, we go neighborhood by neighborhood, doing assemblies, involving people with different socioeconomic background, different ages, and we're very careful about making it inclusive. And finally, I think if you ask people to decide about mobility and bicycles, green areas, to define about healthcare, affordable housing, they will participate because it's something that matters to them. Of course, if it's not relevant to their neighborhood and their community, then they won't participate. This is what we are learning in Barcelona.
Vielen Dank. Ich will eigentlich gar nicht die Kulturpessimistin.
I don't want to be the pessimist with regard to culture here on this panel, but unfortunately I seem to be taking on the role of the pessimist. Lothar Schröder, I need to understand the situation in Germany. So Francesca's final point said that people can decide to use their bicycles more often. Is that something that we, as a car-obsessed country, is possible? So, I mean, this is another question for the trade unionist, although you work for Verdi. So when you hear automotive industry, then this comes with jobs, the question of jobs. Of course, we have jobs that are affected, and we're going to lose a lot of jobs. The HR director of Volkswagen did his calculations, and he said when they have more robots in place, and then the hourly wages for that are very low, and then how can a human worker compete with that? I mean, of course, this has to do with working conditions and with a working environment. But at the same time, digitalization provides opportunities. If the automotive industry, for example, it takes e-mobility as a priority. Then we need to establish a link to how we develop our cities, because this is the limiting factor in e-mobility in total. So the charging stations, how can we get that aspect into the cities, that I can buy an e-vehicle and then charge it everywhere? So, but this is not the way that our city is designed. And what about the street lights? And Deutsche Telekom, they put these boxes and Dieslam, that's what they're called, and they have power, and they try to turn that into the charging stations for e-cars. I mean, that's an approach. But what about the cars that will be there in the roads tomorrow, and all e-vehicles cannot be only fully charged, but rather also decharged, so that to take 30 minutes to take the charge off the cars, I mean, it isn't actually not a problem, but I mean, we need the technologies for that. So we need to think about that. And then there was a heckling there and saying that we don't want to have a state regulation for everything. I mean, unfortunately, this cannot be interpreted as it is an off-mic comment. It is true. When we had a dispute about ISDN, then it would be good if we wanted to have that to be rolled out across the country. But I mean, now we're faced with the situation. We're faced with reality. What do we do with that? And let me give you an example. The majority of our schools are state-controlled. And what about digitization in schools? So what about broadband availability? What about the equipment of our schools? So, I mean, you can also be exaggerating about that. So because when we talk about schools, we talk about the quality of the WCs, the water closets, and not about the PCs, the personal computers. And in public events, we always say that we want to have a major leap ahead in our schools and in our education. But what about the equipment? What about the modern equipment? Is it there? So do we have computers in our schools? And I think that it is very important that you make investments, that you make funds available. So you can't just say that this is a program that you want to implement, but you really need to have a rollout gradual program, so that of course you need to repair bridges, for example, but you also need to connect schools to the digitization that will happen tomorrow. What about the opinion of the Telekom representative in this context? So if I'm asked to answer that question, of course I can understand this heckler. And if we had gone for this approach, I mean, it actually wasn't the case. So I need to talk about the past. So if we had decided that, then you could have said that you could have a telecommunications as a public service. And then on top of that, I can have some service providers, Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica, and Vodafone offering additional services. This is also what Francesca said. And this is a possible approach. But I can't change what we decided in the past. But you shouldn't forget one point, however. In China, it has already happened in that exact way. But where did they end up? And the question is, what do we want to achieve and what can we achieve? And we need to find a middle ground. And that's my cautious comment. And Ms. Esken, you wanted to take the floor, so about the digital pact. The federal government, after overcoming the cooperation ban, and I hope that the opposition party will help us to overcome other obstacles as well, so that we invest 5 billion for equipping the schools better, and maybe equip them with Wi-Fi, and also equip them with good learning platforms. This is a major step, and this is a good starting point. But the regions, and this is also part of our pact at the federal level, is that the regions, they get the support for the educations and for education models in schools and for the schools themselves. And it is not only about using devices, because I mean, with the devices, learning will not change, but it is rather the approach of teaching that you need to revise. I mean, if we work differently, if we live differently, then you also need to teach differently. And this is a cultural change as well. That is is a consequence of that. I mean, we need to treat people as equal partners in work, in schools, and so that means participation in urban planning and in regional planning needs to work, and we need to talk to each other. We need to understand that we need to use our various skills and use them for the best of everybody. And I think that it is very important that municipalities should not only assume that the civil society will take over and then that we leave one agenda item for them, but rather everybody needs to take their own responsibilities and play their roles. I would like to add to this in order to get back to the topic of tomorrow's city. What I know from experience and from implementing the various programs, it is a completely different question that we need to focus on. It is about business models. I mean, of course, it is nice what Francesca has presented, and you can read all about that on the internet, but how does a municipality, a city do that? I mean, let me stay with my example of Cuxhaven, because I know what they do. And I mean, this is a small municipality, but we can also talk about smaller municipalities. What is the business model behind that municipality? Because that is the essential factor. So when you see here, we have 500 people, and if everybody had to pay an entrance fee, €1, then I would have 500 euros. And maybe in a municipality, I have only 15 people, then I would only have a revenue of 15 euros and compared to 500 euros. And if I offer a service for 15 people or for 500 people, that is a big difference. Because the issue here, when I talk about public services that need to be provided, I mean, I agree what you mean. So I grew up in a very small rural community, but the question is now, and I think that we need a combination of a public sector and the private sector and the civil society. How can we manage that? I don't run into a situation in a rural community with difficulties of mobility, so that, for example, Deutsche Bahn decides that they won't stop there any longer because nobody wants to go there, so there are only 15 people living there. So it doesn't make any commercial sense to have that in its as a stop in their network in the railway system. And maybe politics can help. And I know that that politicians try to help the rural communities as well. So, but how can we adapt the business models? Maybe subsidies will be important. How can we just make an initiative that a company says, okay, I will provide the service, and by providing the service, I can make life livable in the rural areas as well, so that people don't leave. But when I talk about smart communities also in rural areas, you need investments. I would like to have your reaction. So, and then after this round, we're going to open the discussion for the floor. So then you talked to me, you addressed me with giving a bad example of the Deutsche Bahn, so because the privatization issue came in there. So then when you got an industry sector that was privatized and not state controlled, and how you can run into hot water with that. Of course, I am in favor of offering public services, of broadband and telecommunications services, our public services, because, I mean, this enables participation. Because if we don't do that, then we can't take everybody on board if we didn't offer these public services and provide them for everybody. But in an ideal world, I mean, that would be the different approach. We would have a genuine market, but we don't have it. It is some kind of an artificial market that we have, a very restricted, regulated market where that can't work at all. So when you look at the broadband situation in Germany, this is a market failure here. I mean, I'm sorry that I have to be that blunt about it, but when the state has no influence on that, but just maybe uses subsidies here and there, but that's actually not really a success story. This was a decision that was taken a long time ago, and we still suffer from that decision. And the question now is about data. What about the data that need to be distributed in a certain network, are we going to make the same mistakes? Or should we have a data ownership, not in the sense of a property, because property is a difficult term, but rather sovereignty over data, so that it should stay with the public sector and with the citizens. That's what I think is a good idea. And there's monopolies of these technological giants with regard to data and with regard to technology, because this is what we have as a starting point for the technological development, and we can't leave everything to them. So we need to rethink and see whether we need to go for a different approach. And there was a proposal made by Andrea Nahles in the Villeurbanne house, the headquarters of the SPD party, and I think that we need to make data used by everybody for the good of everybody. And maybe we can get back to this discussion later on, because Andrea Nahles is going to join us in it for the next session. So, and then we have Lothar Schröder who wanted to take the floor. So at the moment, when you say that we need to look at the business models, everybody accepts that. Of course, that is important. But what does it mean? It means that when we think of the future in terms of business models, then we talk about revenues. They need to be profitable. We talk about the demand, but not about needs. And if we want to develop a vision about how we want to use artificial intelligence in the future, we need to talk about needs. And the needs should be the basis for state regulation. And then we can think about how we want to control it and regulate it when we know what the needs of the citizens are. Here in Germany, I mean, when we think in terms only of business models, then also in the government, and when the first licenses were auctioned off for a public telecommunications network, then Mr. Eichel was very happy to earn 50 billion euros, and this Spaniards, they had some kind of a beauty contest who provides the services for the fastest. And I mean, they did it in a very efficient way, but we were not capable of that. Maybe just an explanation. In the 80s, I traveled from one rural area to another. So I warned against privatizing telecommunication services because I knew one thing. Well, actually, I didn't really know it, but I just assumed that it may be cheaper, but we won't have a supply everywhere. Mr. Selbach is going to ask the first question. So you already had the floor this morning, but I think that you're going to ask a very interesting question in this session as well. Ulrich Sendler is my name. Thank you very much, Ms. Bria, for your wonderful presentation. My question, I would like to ask later also in private. Could I get information from you, more detailed information from you than what you have presented right now, so that we can share that here in Germany with others? That's going to be my question later on in our private discussion later on. But I also want to make a brief comment. I am devastated. Telecommunications and Deutsche Telekom, you're talking about business models. But we're not talking about business models in Ms. Bria's presentation. She talked about the needs of the citizens. She talked about the data of the citizens. Why can't you do the same? Ms. Esken's question, or the question for Ms. Esken, was answered by saying that citizens won't agree because the data needs to be transferred to the municipality. Ms. Bria said the complete opposite. She said that the data is owned by the citizens and the municipalities just make sure that they're safe. And Mr. Schröder, I agreed with you in your last comment, but before you said that we Germans are like that, but I don't believe that. It's not that we are the way that everybody sees us, or some people see us. We're not that different from others. If we had these suggestions, such as made by Ms. Bria and made in cities, it will work the same way in Germany as well, I'm sure. And I would bet everything.
Soll ich anfangen?
Well, do you want to answer to that? Because we'll have to look facts in the face. It won't really question. So if there is a misunderstanding, clarify that, and then we'll move on with questions. I think I was misunderstood in the question that, things don't work with the data. What I said was, I want citizens, ordinary people, to have sovereignty over their own data, their personal data, but that other data generated elsewhere, even anonymized data, these people, or machine data, sensor data, traffic flow data, but these should not remain with companies, but also with society. That's what I said. I'd like to add something to this. And maybe I was misunderstood as well. No, I mean, it's quite important to me to set that right. As a company, let's put it this way. I'm Telekom, but I'm research and development. I don't sell anything. I'm talking to cities, and I've been doing my job for 7 years. I've talked to God knows how many municipalities. And what I propagate is what we're going to do in the near future, do a workshop with the municipality, first talk to the citizens and see what we're doing. That's our philosophy. That's what we're trying to do. But we have to get there first. And yet, sadly, we're a private company. And at some stage, I have to say, if all I do is pay out and pay out and pay out money, I end up with a problem, because ultimately I work for Telekom. They pay my salary. So at some stage, something has to come out of it. My point was, in the countryside, it's much more difficult to establish a business model than it is in cities. Doesn't have to be like this, but the principle makes it more difficult because you have simply fewer people living there, so the business case is more difficult to achieve. I mean, I'm not trying to say I just want to press money out of everything as Telekom or for Telekom. It's not true. We just have to see what is economically feasible. So right opposite me in the center, with the dark red top, Gesine Reiche is my name. There's a question which is quite important to me regarding smart cities, is one we haven't addressed yet, namely cybersecurity. So a question to Ms. Bria. What do you do in Barcelona regarding cyber attacks?
Which is answer,
please.
Yeah. Well, actually, we take cybersecurity as all the technology industry pretty seriously. So we have we have the Catalan cybersecurity agency, so we work together with them. So certain issues that pertains on national security is not, of course, a matter of cities, but we do obey on all kind of security standards. And as I said before, security and privacy by design, we do like a privacy and security impact assessment before we develop the services. And then, I mean, we haven't had like massive cyber threats at the moment, even in the more critical part of the running of the city, but we do that on kind of like standards, and we work with the cybersecurity agency. But this is an important point, because more and more this is in the Internet of Things, for instance, we saw some really large cases of attacks in an unprecedented scale. So definitely you need to tackle that. I do also think that, for instance, we're doing a policy where we internalize some of the infrastructure for purpose of security. So a lot of the business model for IT management in cities has been like outsourcing everything, completely everything, while you need to have control over critical cyber infrastructure, as I said before. For instance, data centers of the city, how you manage that. I mean, making sure that critical services around security and so on are more controlled, and you have a more democratic control over those services. I think it helps to address security as well.
Thank you. Der Herr dort
the gentleman over there in the dark clothes, somewhere in the center. You wearing something dark? My name is Book. Ms. Bria, I'm asking in English.
Keynote speech. You said that Barcelona is ready to lead the way. If we talk about how little cities in Germany, for instance, could handle the transition to smart cities, I mean, we have what we call innovation transfer. We have European working groups for regions and cities. We have knowledge transfer. How much potential do you see in it, and what are the steps we need to take to get there?
I think I try to make very clear the approach that I'm suggesting in my presentation, which is actually linked a little bit to the questions over the business model. So I think the problems for how the smart cities have developed until now is that they started from a kind of actually telco or IT providers approach. And I mean, actually the old smart city was invented by IBM and Cisco as a way to sell municipalities their own products. The thing is that what happened, because basically companies have their own vertical business models. I mean, I suggest to cities always to ask who owns what in the smart city, because then you can have a good inventory and you understand what critical assets you need to take under democratic control, what you can open to the market, and how you can make sure that citizens have delivered affordable services of good quality, because many cities end up broke and with no services. I mean, even when it comes to basic like recycling, lighting, I mean, the model has been really unsustainable. And the thing is because the business model is unsustainable. Now Google comes in and okay, they want to make money out of the data. So they tell to the municipalities, well, let's talk about the business model later. But I think it is a fundamental question. What I'm suggesting, instead of only starting from the technology, although the technology is gonna be an important part, the Barcelona model is we own the fiber. So this is, I don't know if this is something that can be replicated in Germany or you have a different model, but then you can make partnership with the telcos or I mean, however this is better. I think we're working on open standards as much as possible, because otherwise you end up a sensor of a specific private sensor in the lighting system that doesn't communicate with sensors that you have in the parking, which doesn't communicate with sensors to monitor energy. So you end up solving technology problems. I mean, we saw it with cities all the time. So you need a strategy. That's why Barcelona has built interoperability at the layer of sensor. So we work with open standard layer. And the data lake that we're building, we have a common ontologies for data so that we can aggregate data on the basis and we can analyze then data. So interoperability is key. Well, I think you agree on that. And open standards, free software, actually as much as possible, because then you can make sure that you reuse the software amongst municipalities. We're working a lot in collaboration with municipalities. So there is a lot that municipalities are sharing. If I have an open source license, I can work with the community. Berlin has an amazing community of developers, of software engineers, of hackers, of privacy researchers. These are the people that have to help you build the smart cities. Those communities, these are the ones. So if we build it in open source, you involve the people that have the capacity. Research centers, of course, universities, we have a lot of partnerships. Yeah.
Thank you. Es ist leider die letzte Frage, die wir nehmen.
Now, sadly, this will be our last question. The gentleman in the center. Yes, the one who's just turning round, wearing a blazer. Okay, Matthias Kuhlmann, Berlin City Government Department for Economic Development. Barcelona, that's a sensation. It's brilliant. I mean, you have a socialist, feminist leader in charge who I think could be a fantastic role model for German social democrats, that's for sure. But now my question, because, I mean, a moderator says we have to ask questions, absolutely right, of course. I mean, talking to the SPD or its representative here, by the way, you can say that very clearly. But anyway, many of the questions we've discussed all end with local authorities, municipalities. And Barcelona is also a municipality, by the way, one of the richest in the whole of Spain. But the public sector in municipalities needs to have more finances. We're living in one of the richest countries in the world. We have a lot of prosperity. So, dear member of the government, party member SPD, make sure that municipalities get enough money, because that's the key for virtually all the problems we're discussing. Well, can you talk to the finance minister? It's your party. Well, what you're saying is right, certainly, but we also need to be able to act. We need to have freedom to act, freedom to maneuver. And it's not just money that plays a role there. But yes, I think even in the previous government, we have been relieving municipalities of some of the financial burdens they've been carrying. And we have to continue along this road. But as I indicated, questions like debt ceiling and so on has demonstrated that we can do something, and we're doing it. But there are so many different jobs for municipalities to do, especially the larger municipalities. They have housing problems, they have a lack of teachers and many problems. So it's almost overtaxing them to deal with all of these problems. especially with this deficit regime and the financial deficits. But I agree with you, yes, we have to do something. So I will interject now and say thank you very much to everybody in this round. I've realized you weren't all that happy with my questions, some of you, but I think it was a very interesting and very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much, and thanks to the audience as well.